It's great to welcome to the program today Josh Douglas, who's a law professor at the University of Kentucky and also author of the book Vote for Us: How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. Great to talk to you, first and foremost.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me on.
So we could start this conversation a few different ways. I mean, I think for my audience, they're mostly familiar with the different ways that we've seen mostly the Republican Party attempt to make it more difficult to vote. This includes reducing voting hours, reducing polling locations, putting in place so-called voter ID laws, gerrymandering. I mean, we could go on and on and on. But I think in the interest of sort of having as optimistic a conversation as possible, you identify a bunch of different ways in the book that we can increase voter access and turnout, which I think is a worthy goal, and I think most people in the audience agree. What's some of the lowest hanging fruit to start with that might immediately give us some positive results?
Well, probably automatic voter registration is in some ways the lowest hanging fruit because it's already been passed in over a dozen states. And this is where the state takes responsibility of registering everyone using the information it already has through DMV offices or what have you. And essentially the voter registration lists and the DMV lists talk to each other. I say this is the low hanging fruit again because we've seen success in both so-called red and so-called blue states that have adopted this reform.
And when we talk about automatic registration, there's a couple of different ways I've seen it work. One is when there is some other kind of interaction with a sort of government system, whether you are renewing your license or you are turning 18 or sort of some other ways. What are the different ways that this could actually happen? And is there some way that doesn't involve any kind of interaction? It's simply when you move in someplace and change your address, you're immediately registered to vote.
Yeah, so the requirement that you be given the opportunity to register to vote already exists under federal law. This is the motor voter law that says anytime you interact with a governmental entity like the DMV office, they give you the opportunity to register. What automatic voter registration does is takes that step of opting in out of the equation. The state does it automatically. You don't have to do anything. So anytime you do update your address, say with the DMV office, even if you don't also take the additional step of registering or filling out the form, the state will do it for you. And then they'll send you a postcard saying, well, you've now been registered. If for whatever reason you want to opt out, now you can. And what this does, the results show, is it registers so many more people. Oregon, the first state to do it, registered over 100,000 new voters. And many of these people turned out to vote that probably otherwise wouldn't have had the opportunity to vote.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, which is the second order question is, does someone who is automatically registered rather than choosing to do it, are they actually more likely to go and vote? And it sounds like some of the data says that, yes, they are.
Yeah, in fact, a recent study looked at turnout rates between the different states in the 2018 midterm election and showed that states with either automatic voter registration or same-day registration can show up to the polls and vote at the same time had the highest turnout levels. And the states with registration deadlines of 30 days or 3 weeks before the election had the lowest turnout levels. So these reforms really work. And again, they're implemented in a positive fashion in a handful of states already.
Now, it is possible, to play devil's advocate, that states that have these sort of automatic registration methods are states that, for other reasons, already have fostered sort of a more engaged voting public, and that it's not necessarily because of the automatic registration. But I think we don't need to necessarily get into it at that level here. It seems pretty clear that states that have a certain philosophy on voting do have voter turnout, maybe for a variety of reasons, would be fair to say.
Well, I'd push back on the question of, or the notion that states that already have engaged voters are doing this, because you look at, West Virginia, which was the third state to adopt automatic voter registration, or Georgia, a state that has had many voting woes, and they have automatic voter registration. So this is, you asked about the low-hanging fruit. This is because it's already working in a lot of places.
So you mentioned, I mean, I guess we're talking about this in the context of we have 50 states and different states handle this issue and voting in general very differently. Are there states right now that you've identified that sort of in general would get like an A on voter access and voter enfranchisement?
Yeah, it would be Colorado. Colorado has, I think, the best voting mechanism when it comes to election day itself. It has essentially a combination of universal vote by mail, also known as a vote at home, and vote centers. So in universal vote by mail states, the state automatically mails everyone a ballot about 2 or 3 weeks before election day, whether they've requested it or not. So it's not like absentee balloting where you have to ask for it. It does it automatically. You may not even know an election is about to take place. So you can sit at home and fill it out and research the issues and the candidates so that it leads to a more informed, engaged electorate, and then drop it off at a secure Dropbox or mail it in. And if you don't do that, if you want to vote on election day, if you need some sort of assistance, the state has vote centers, which means that instead of having to go to a home-based precinct, a polling place closest to your home address, you can go to any vote center in the county, and they're all electronically connected. So once you check into one, you can't check into another. And the ballot that gets printed is the ballot for your home address. And so this is the ultimate inconvenience in voting, this combination of automatically receiving a ballot. But then if you really want to go to your polling place or a polling place, you can go to any vote center in your county as well.
So on the other side, which states are the worst as far as this goes?
Well, any of the states that have a 30-day registration deadline, Texas, with its continued woes, in addition to that, its strict voter ID requirements that really don't have any benefit in reducing fraud and yet disenfranchise a good number of people, certain constituencies. Any of the states that don't have this kind of convenience factor in voting, and we see it in the voter turnout numbers.
So I'm originally from Argentina, and in Argentina, we have what's called mandatory voting, which basically means unless you demonstrate that you're living outside of the country, like I am, for example, or unless you have some health reason or other reason for not participating, and you've sort of presented that to the state, you are expected to vote and can be fined or otherwise punished if you don't. What's your sense generally from a philosophical standpoint about mandatory voting? And then from a logistical standpoint, is it actually something that would be desirable? Because choosing not to vote, if you're doing so freely, although I'm not in favor of that as a strategy, it is something people can do to show displeasure with the system. It is still a conscious decision people can make. Yeah,
so Argentina has that. Australia has mandatory voting with turnout of over 90%. And, this leads to, it seems like a pretty engaged, informed electorate. And so philosophically, I think anything we can do to encourage participation while coupled with improved civics education is a good idea. Now, do I think this is likely or possible in the United States? No. I think philosophically people are against it. Although I'd note that in any mandatory voting system, you would have to have an option essentially for, I don't like any of the bums. And so the requirement is to show up, not necessarily to choose one of the candidates. But I do think that if we adopted all of the reforms that I mentioned in the book, thanks to these everyday Americans who are championing them in their local communities, then we would get to something a lot closer to universal turnout. And, I have it at the end of the book, I say, like, why not aspire to something like 90% turnout? That seems crazy in our current environment and given the numbers of 60% turnout in presidential elections. 2018 midterms had 50% turnout, and we were celebrating that high voter engagement. It was a record. And I thought, if half the electorate isn't showing up, why are we celebrating? Yeah. But I think if we strive to something like 90% and we make it part of the way, then we'll be doing a lot better.
So I guess the next sort of layer of discussion that seems relevant is you outline a lot of these reforms and you talk about, as you call them, democracy champions that at local levels are actually activating to try to get some of these reforms enacted. But there is, to some degree, this kind of vicious circle where the voting system we have is determined in great part by the people that are representing us, that are our elected officials. Those are people who have benefited from the system we have insofar as they've gotten elected under it. And so in great part, they may not actually be motivated to make the changes that you're describing. So what are the actual activist actions? Which pieces of this do just activists have control and power over? And which parts actually require first voting some different people into office?
Well, it really depends on the state law and the ability of voters to have ballot propositions, whether it is for local elections or statewide elections. You look at a place like Michigan that had horrible partisan gerrymandering in the way it draws its lines. And the state just passed a state constitutional amendment to implement an independent redistricting commission to draw the lines the next time we do this, starting in 2021. So Michigan voters had the opportunity and ability to pass a ballot proposition requiring that. In other states, that's not possible. And then again, if we talk about local laws, some states give their localities what's known as home rule, or essentially authority to have local specific laws for their local elections. And you see a lot of movement in places like Maryland and California. In Tennessee, we've seen some successes for local reforms. So it really is location specific. But here's what I'd say is that let's make the efforts and implement the actions in the places where it is legally possible, because that creates an evidence. That creates a body of evidence to show to the other states, hey, this actually works, to improve turnout, to gain a much more engaged, informed electorate. And it's not a partisan power grab. It's simply a democracy power grab.
Can this discussion be separated from the discussion about how politics is financed in the United States, or are these really related issues that have to be dealt with in tandem?
Well, I think the financing of politics is its own separate issue to reform it, but of course also informs the ability to make a lot of these other changes. But I have a separate chapter on campaign finance reform, and specifically public financing, and what some places like Maine and Seattle are doing to improve the access of ability for people to run for office. So I think it's both a separate issue as well as something that works in tandem with all these other reforms.
And kind of in parallel with that, I'm curious whether you see the way in which, at least at the presidential level, we have this electoral college system. I mean, is that something that you think plays into the reforms you're talking about, or is that more of a separate issue?
Well, I think the Electoral College plays into the voter apathy concern that involves so many of our elections. And, one reason that people don't vote is they feel like it's not going to make a difference, and why bother? And then, if you're a Republican in California or a Democrat in Texas, you think that, the result is essentially preordained in the Electoral College. But that said, there's also a reform possible for the Electoral College itself that I talk about briefly towards the end of the book. And this is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, where essentially states are agreeing that instead of awarding their Electoral College votes to whoever wins their state, they'll award it to the National Popular Vote winner. And that's really gaining steam as well.
Yep, that we've actually talked about that quite a bit. And of course, until there are enough states whose sum total of electors totals 270, it doesn't get triggered. But a number of states, and I don't remember it, for some reason, I think it's 12 or 13. Is that right? Have signed on so far?
I think it's maybe 12 plus DC now.
That's a very interesting initiative, which we'll keep talking about. We've been speaking with Josh Douglas, who's a law professor at the University of Kentucky, about his book, Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. Josh, really a pleasure having you on today.
Thank you so much. This has been fun.